She said it like a reflex, not cruel, not calculated, just easy. She's easy to replace anyway. Victoria Hale heard those 4 words through a 2-inch gap in a mahogany door, holding a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold on the walk down the hall. 2 sugars, no cream, always hot, except tonight it wasn't, because she'd stopped to retie the loose thread on her cardigan, and now she stood frozen outside her husband's office, while the man she had given 8 years of her life to discussed her disposal like he was talking about switching suppliers. She didn't drop the cup. That's the part that stayed with her afterward. Her hands didn't shake. She just stood there, breathing, waiting for the correction that never came. If that were you, standing in that hallway, holding that coffee, what would you have done? If you're watching this and you've ever given everything to someone who didn't see it, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels, because Victoria's story is one that crosses every border. And if you're new here, subscribe and stay until the end. The next chapter of this one will shake you. Now let's go back to the beginning. 8 years is a long time to love someone who treats your presence like furniture. Victoria Hale hadn't always been the kind of woman who accepted that. When she was 26 and first walked into Damian Blackwood's world, she was the kind of person who pushed back. She argued. She had opinions about things. She laughed too loudly at dinner tables and once told a state senator he was being condescending to his face in front of 8 people and didn't apologize for it afterward. That Victoria still existed. She just got quieter over the years. Not because Damian broke her. She needed to be clear about that, even to herself. He hadn't been cruel. Hadn't raised his hand, hadn't lied in the obvious ways men sometimes lie. He simply occupied space. He filled every room he walked into so completely that other people over time learned to make themselves smaller. Not because he asked them to, just because that's what happened around a man like Damian Blackwood. She'd met him at a fundraising gala for a children's literacy organization. She'd been there representing the nonprofit she worked for. He'd been there because someone on his team decided it was good for optics. She hadn't known who he was, which meant she talked to him like a normal person, which meant he was immediately, inconveniently interested. Their first conversation lasted 40 minutes. He stood with his back to the room, which was something she noticed later. A man who controlled everything, choosing to ignore the crowd and focus entirely on her. She'd thought it was romantic. She understood later it was habit. Damian Blackwood focused on whatever he considered worth his attention. When his attention moved, it moved completely. She just hadn't expected to be the thing it moved away from. The Blackwood estate sat behind iron gates on 12 acres outside New York City, which meant Victoria had spent 8 years living inside a symbol of power that belonged entirely to someone else. The house was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful. Deliberately, carefully, with no room for accident. Dark wood paneling, high ceilings, staff who moved quietly and spoke only when spoken to. Victoria had changed that last part at least. Within 6 months of moving in, she knew the names of every person who worked there. Not just first names. She knew that Ramon, the head groundskeeper, had a son with a heart condition who'd had surgery the previous winter. She knew that Petra, who handled the West Wing rooms, sent money home to her mother in Croatia every month without fail. She knew that Marcus, who drove Damian to his meetings, had been trying to finish his associate's degree for 3 years but kept running out of time. She asked about these things. She remembered the answers. She followed up. It was not strategic. It was just who she was. Damian's mother, Eleanor Blackwood, was 73 years old and had the particular sharpness of a woman who had survived decades of a life that required vigilance. She and Victoria had not liked each other at first. Eleanor was protective of her son in the way that mothers of powerful men sometimes are, suspicious of softness, wary of warmth that hadn't been tested. But Eleanor got sick in the second winter, a respiratory illness that became a longer recovery than anyone expected, and Victoria had sat with her through the worst of it. Not because she felt obligated, not because Damian asked. He'd been in meetings in Boston for most of that week. She sat with Eleanor because Eleanor was frightened and trying very hard not to show it, and Victoria recognized that feeling. After that, Eleanor stopped being suspicious. She started being something closer to grateful, then something closer to love. Juan. The night it happened was a Tuesday in November. It had been raining since afternoon, the kind of heavy, sustained rain that made the estate feel cut off from the rest of the world. Victoria had been in the kitchen earlier that evening, talking with the chef, Ilaria, about changing the menu for Thursday's dinner. Eleanor had been having trouble with certain textures since her last bout of illness, and they were quietly adjusting things without making it obvious, because Eleanor hated being handled. That was the kind of problem Victoria spent her days solving. Not the large ones, not the empire-threatening ones, the human ones. She'd made Damien's coffee herself that night because Ilaria had already cleaned the espresso machine, and Victoria hadn't wanted to create extra work. 2 sugars, no cream, always hot. She knew the proportions without measuring anymore. 8 years had a way of doing that to a person. He was in his office with 2 of his lieutenants, men she recognized but barely knew, because Damien kept his work and his home in separate compartments, and Victoria respected that line even when it frustrated her. She wasn't supposed to be involved. She didn't want to be involved. She just wanted to bring him his coffee and say goodnight. She heard his voice before she reached the door. She couldn't make out the words at first, just the cadence, even, controlled, the way Damien always spoke during business. No elevation, no stress. He treated billion-dollar decisions with the same flat effect he used to order takeout. Then she caught a sentence. She wasn't entirely sure she'd heard it correctly, so she stopped. Runs the household, handles my mother, keeps the staff in line. It's efficient. One of the other voices said something she couldn't make out. Damien answered immediately. She's easy to replace anyway. The hallway was very quiet. The rain hit the windows. Victoria stood with the coffee cup in both hands, steam rising, and waited for the caveat. The but. The correction. The something that made that sentence mean something other than what it sounded like. Damien said, "Get me the Marcello file." That was all. She stood there for another 10 seconds. She counted them. One of the other men said something about schedule, and Damien responded, and the conversation moved on the way. Conversations move on when what's been said is not a mistake to be corrected, but just a thing that's true. Victoria placed the cup on the small table beside the office door. She didn't knock. She didn't push the door open. She turned around and walked back down the hallway. Her footsteps made no sound on the carpet. She didn't cry that night. That surprised her. She'd expected to, had braced for it almost as a reflex. The way her chest had tightened when she heard those words, she'd assumed the tears would follow naturally. But she sat on the edge of the bed in the room she shared with Damien and felt instead a very strange clarity. She thought about the first year, how she'd restructured her entire life around his schedule without being asked, because it seemed like the right thing to do for someone whose life was as complicated as his. She'd told herself it was partnership. She'd told herself you don't keep score in a marriage. She thought about the second year, when she'd miscarried a pregnancy she'd been frightened to tell him about, and afterwards sat alone in the hospital because Damien had been in a meeting she couldn't reach him through, and she'd told herself that was okay, that she understood, that his world demanded things she couldn't compete with. She thought about the charity events where she'd watched him work a room, the way he could be charming when he chose to, when it served something, the way he'd put his hand on her back in front of people, and she'd felt it like a gift, and known even at the time that it said something troubling about her that a hand on her back felt like a gift. She wasn't angry at Damien Blackwood that night. That was the thing she hadn't expected. She was angry at herself. At the version of her who had stayed so long, given so much, made herself so useful that a man who moved empires had looked at her and seen. Efficiency. Staff management, household function, easy to replace. She thought about that phrase for a long time. She turned it over. She examined it, the way you examine something that's damaged to understand whether it can be fixed. And slowly, sitting in that room with the rain still coming down outside, she understood something. She had been replacing herself for years. The woman she used to be, the one who pushed back, who laughed too loud, who told condescending senators exactly what she thought. That woman had been quietly substituted, part by part, with someone optimized for this life. Useful, efficient, replaceable. She hadn't been erased by Damien. She'd done it herself, trying to deserve him. She slept that night. That was the second thing that surprised her. She lay down and closed her eyes, and the sleep came. Not the desperate sleep of someone exhausted by grief, but something more settled, something that felt uncomfortably like relief. Damien came to bed sometime after midnight. She heard him move through the room, quiet out of habit or consideration. She'd never been entirely sure which. He didn't wake her. He settled beside her, and his breathing slowed within minutes. She lay in the dark, awake, studying the ceiling. She thought, I am 34 years old. She thought, I have been managing this house, this family, this man's life, and calling it love. She thought, he isn't wrong about the efficiency. He's only wrong about what can replace it. Because here was the thing Damien Blackwood did not understand. The thing Victoria herself was only beginning to see clearly in the particular sharpness of that sleepless night. It wasn't the coffee that couldn't be replaced. It wasn't the household management. It wasn't the staff coordination or the charity appearances or the careful way she adjusted Thursday's menu for Eleanor's digestion. It was the fact that she had loved this place, really loved it. Not as a performance, not as a strategy, but in the exhausting, unglamorous, entirely human way that means you notice when Ramon's son has a follow-up appointment and you remember to ask about it, and you sit with a frightened old woman through a respiratory illness in a cold February because she's frightened and shouldn't have to be alone. That couldn't be replaced. Not because Victoria was extraordinary. She wasn't, not in the ways the world usually notices. But because that kind of caring is not a function. It's not a role you post and fill. It is a specific person choosing, every day, to show up entirely. And she had been choosing that. She would need to make a different choice now. The next morning, Victoria woke before the alarm. She showered, she dressed. She went downstairs and sat with Eleanor for 40 minutes over tea, and they talked about the garden and Eleanor's opinion of a novel she'd been reading, and Victoria laughed twice at things Eleanor said because Eleanor was genuinely funny when she allowed herself to be. She did not make Damien's coffee. When Damien came down to the kitchen and found the espresso machine cold, he looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who has misplaced something small and cannot immediately identify what it is. He made his own coffee. It wasn't quite right. He'd always struggled with the proportions. And he didn't say anything about it. Victoria noticed this. She said nothing. She moved through the morning the way she always moved, calm, attentive, present. She checked in with Petra about the West Wing rooms. She called the hospital to confirm Eleanor's follow-up appointment. She returned 2 calls from the charity board she sat on. She was not cold to Damien. She was not hostile. She did not make a scene, did not raise her voice, did not deliver the kind of confrontation that a woman with less discipline might have delivered in the heat of the previous night. She was simply present, in her own life. For the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, she was taking up the space she'd slowly vacated, moving through this house as though she lived in it rather than maintained it. Damien watched her across the breakfast table with the expression he used when something in a deal wasn't adding up. She recognized that expression. She'd seen it in boardrooms, in photographs, in the set of his shoulders during difficult phone calls. She'd never been the subject of it before. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that it didn't frighten her. By the 3rd day, the coffee was a symbol. Neither of them acknowledged this. That was almost its own kind of communication. For 8 years, that cup of coffee had been waiting for him when he returned from his meetings. In the early years, she'd done it because she wanted to. In the middle years, she'd done it out of habit. In the later years, she'd done it because the habit had calcified into something she didn't examine, a ritual that felt like love but functioned more like maintenance. Now it wasn't there. And Damien Blackwood, who had negotiated with men who put guns on tables as conversational props, who had stared down federal investigators without blinking, who had built an underground empire on the precise calculation of what things were worth. This man stood in his kitchen on the 3rd morning and stared at an empty counter with an expression that looked almost like loss. He didn't say anything. He went to his office and did not return until late. And Victoria, sitting on the terrace with Eleanor that evening, watching the last of the autumn light leave the garden, felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like herself. Not the efficient, replaceable version. The real one. The one that Damien Blackwood had failed to notice was there, and would now spend whatever time remained discovering he could not live without. She didn't know that part yet. Not consciously. But somewhere underneath the clarity and the grief and the strange, disorienting peace of the last 3 days, something in her had already started to understand how this story was going to move. She picked up her tea. She watched the garden go dark. She let herself feel, not the anger, not the wound, but the oldest part of herself that had gone quiet and was now, slowly, beginning to speak again. And that was enough. For tonight, that was enough. 4 days after the night in the hallway, Damien Blackwood sat across from his wife at the breakfast table and realized he didn't know how to talk to her. That was new. He had conversations with dangerous men for a living. He negotiated under pressure, rid rooms, read people, found the lever in any situation, and applied exactly the right amount of force. That was not a skill he'd been born with. It was something he'd built over 20 years of watching what happened when you miscalculated. He did not miscalculate often anymore. But Victoria was sitting 3 feet away from him with a cup of tea and a book she wasn't really reading, and he could not find the lever. He said, "You're up early." She said, "I usually am," which was true, and also not an answer, and also somehow closed the door on wherever that sentence might have gone. He looked at her for a moment. She turned a page. He picked up his phone. The thing about silence is that it has different weights. Damien had lived with operational silence his entire adult life. The silence of men who kept secrets, the silence of rooms where things were decided that couldn't be spoken. That silence was familiar. It had texture. He understood its rules. Victoria's silence was different. It wasn't hostile. That was the part that unsettled him most. A hostile silence he could have worked with, found the wound, applied pressure, negotiated his way toward resolution. He knew how to move through conflict. Conflict had structure. This had no structure. She was kind to everyone in the house. She laughed with Eleanor. She remembered Marcus's exam schedule and asked about it Wednesday morning over the intercom when he pulled the car around. She sat with Petra for 20 minutes looking at photographs Petra had received from Croatia. Her mother at some kind of local festival, a little blurred, taken on a cheap phone. Victoria had looked at every single photograph. She'd asked which one was the church her mother had talked about. She was present everywhere, except with him. Not absent. That would have been easier to name. She answered his questions. She appeared at dinner. When the Castellano family sent a formal invitation to their winter event, and it required a response, she handled it exactly the way she always had, correct and prompt. She did not disappear. She simply recalibrated. And the recalibration excluded him in a way he couldn't articulate and therefore couldn't address. The confrontation happened on a Friday. Not because Damien planned it. He wasn't a man who walked into conversations unprepared. Normally, he'd have waited until he understood what he was dealing with. But Friday morning, Victoria had come into the kitchen while he was still there, which was unusual, and she'd started making her own breakfast with the complete self-sufficiency of someone who had stopped expecting company, and something about that particular image. Her back to him, moving around the kitchen like he wasn't there, entirely comfortable, entirely contained, cracked something open in his chest that he didn't have a clean name for. He said, "Victoria." She turned. Her expression was polite. That was almost worse than anger. "Are you going to tell me what's happening?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. The way she looked at him had changed in ways he couldn't fully inventory. Something had been removed from it, some quality that he was only now realizing had always been there, and its absence was the kind of thing you notice the way you notice a sound stopping. "Nothing's happening," she said. "That's not true." "Then what do you think is happening?" He set down his phone. He turned to face her fully, the way he turned to face things that required his full attention. "You're different. You've been different for 4 days. I want to know why." She tilted her head slightly. "Have I done something wrong?" "That's not what I said." "The house is running fine. Eleanor's appointment is Thursday. The Castellano response went out Wednesday." She paused. "If there's a specific problem, tell me what it is." He stared at her. "You know that's not what I'm asking." "Then I'm not sure what you're asking, Damien." She turned back to the counter. End of conversation. Not slammed, not locked, just quietly, firmly closed. He stood behind her for 3 seconds that felt like much longer, then walked out. In the hallway, he stopped. His jaw was tight. He noticed that and noticed that he was noticing it, which was itself unusual. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of his neck where the tension had gathered and stood in the hallway his father had built and thought, "Something is wrong and I don't know what it is and I don't know how to fix what I can't identify." For Damien Blackwood, that was a specific kind of hell. Oh, he called his oldest lieutenant Caruso that afternoon. Not about business, or not directly. They met at the restaurant Caruso kept on the Lower East Side, a place that served genuinely terrible pasta and was therefore almost never crowded, which was precisely why they used it. Caruso was 61 years old and had been with the Blackwood operation since before Damien took it over from his father. He had a face that looked like it had been folded incorrectly several times and never fully recovered, and small eyes that saw more than they appeared to. Damien didn't explain the situation. He said, "How do you know when something's wrong with a person, when they won't tell you directly?" Caruso chewed his bread. "You watch what they stop doing." Damien said nothing. "People don't announce things," Caruso said. "They just stop. Stop calling. Stop asking. Stop being there in the ways they used to be." He picked up his wine, examined it, put it back down without drinking. "By the time most men notice, it's already been over for a while." "You're talking about women." "I'm talking about people." Caruso shrugged one shoulder. "But yes, Usually women. Men are slower. Damien drove home in silence. Marcus didn't speak, which was one of the things Damien valued about Marcus. The man understood when the car was not a place for conversation. He thought about what Caruso had said. Stop doing. He went back through the last 4 days in the specific, inventory-minded way he approached problems that required reconstruction. What had stopped? The coffee. Obvious, first. But also, she no longer waited up. She used to be awake, or at least present, when he came home from late meetings. He hadn't noticed until the third night, coming home at 11:30 to a dark bedroom, that he'd grown accustomed to the lamp being on. She no longer put her hand on his arm when she passed him. Small thing. He wouldn't have been able to say a week ago whether she did that or not. He would have said, probably. But now that it was gone, he could feel its specific absence, the shape of a gesture that had been part of the texture of his daily life, without him ever once consciously registering it. He thought, what else am I missing? The question was larger than he wanted it to be. Eleanor found him in the library that evening. She didn't announce herself. She rarely did. She moved through her own house with the authority of a woman who had never needed permission to enter any room, and she settled into the chair across from his with the careful, deliberate movement of someone managing 73-year-old joints without making it visible. She said, "You look terrible." He said, "Thank you." "What did you do?" He looked up from the papers he wasn't really reading. "What makes you think I did something?" "Because you're sitting in here alone at 8 o'clock on a Friday, and my daughter-in-law is in the east sitting room reading, which is also unusual for her, and neither of you has been in the same room for more than 10 minutes in 4 days. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "I'm old, Damien. I'm not blind." He set down the papers. "She won't tell me what's wrong." "Did you ask?" "Yes." "Did you ask the right way, or did you ask the way you ask everything, like you're expecting a report?" He said nothing. Eleanor made a small sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a laugh. "That woman has run this household for 8 years. She sat with me through a February I would rather not remember. She knows the name of every person who works for you, and I mean actually knows. Not the way you know names because someone briefed you, but the way you know someone because you paid attention." She paused. "When is the last time you paid attention to her the same way?" "She's my wife." "I know she is. That's not an answer." He stood up. He moved to the window. Outside, the garden was dark, and the lights along the path made orange circles on the stone. He said, with the careful control of a man who did not often say things like this, "I don't know what she needs from me." Eleanor said, "Yes, you do. You just don't want to look at it." She got up slowly, steadying herself on the arm of the chair without asking for help. She never asked for help, and walked to the door. At the door, she stopped. "Victoria doesn't break things when she's upset," Eleanor said. "She doesn't yell. She doesn't punish." Her voice was level and a little hard. "She gets quiet. And when a woman like that gets quiet, Damien, you are already very close to the edge." She left. He stayed at the window for a long time. I went to find Victoria at 9 o'clock. She was in the east sitting room the way his mother had said, a lamp on beside her chair, a book in her lap, a half-finished glass of something on the table. She looked up when he came in. She didn't close the book. He sat down on the couch across from her, not beside her. He didn't want her to feel cornered. He sat across, in the open, which was itself unusual for a man who was accustomed to controlling the geometry of every room he entered. He said, "I need you to talk to me." She said, "About what?" "About what changed." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, wind moved through the trees. He could hear the clock on the mantel. She said, "Nothing changed, I just stopped pretending." "Pretending what?" "That things were different from what they are." Her voice was even, contained. "That's all." "What does that mean, Victoria? Say it plainly." She closed the book. She set it on the table beside her glass. She looked at him with an expression he had never quite seen on her face before. Not anger, not grief, but something worn and very clear, the expression of a person who has passed through something and come out the other side changed. She said, "I heard you, Tuesday night, outside your office." The room got very quiet. He went back through Tuesday in his mind, fast, the way he replayed conversations when the stakes shifted. He found it. His chest tightened with something that was not quite guilt and not quite shame, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. He said, "Victoria." "You don't have to explain it," she said. "You were talking about operations. I understand how you think. I was a function. Functions can be upgraded, transferred, replaced. She picked up her glass. Her hand was steady. It's very efficient thinking. I've spent 8 years inside a life that runs on efficient thinking. That's not what I meant. What did you mean? The question sat between them. He opened his mouth and found, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he did not have an answer prepared. He was not a man who got caught without an answer. He built answers in advance, anticipated questions, prepared for every variable. He had not prepared for this. I don't know, he said. It came out before he'd decided to say it. Small, unguarded, entirely true. She looked at him. Something moved in her face. Not softening, exactly, but a shift. Like she'd been expecting a certain kind of response and had received something different and didn't know yet what to do with it. She said, "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in months." It landed like a slap. Not because it was cruel, she'd said it quietly, without heat, but because it was accurate, and accurate things, when you haven't been paying attention, have a particular kind of force. He sat with it. "I want to fix this," he said. "I know you do." "Then tell me how." She was quiet for a long moment. She turned the glass in her hands. Outside, the wind had gotten stronger, and it pressed against the window glass in a steady, low sound. "You can't fix this the way you fix things, Damien," she finally said. "You can't negotiate it. You can't delegate it. You can't put the right people in the right positions and solve it." She paused. "You have to actually change. And I don't mean for a week. I don't mean until things go back to how they were." She met his eyes. "I mean, actually change. And I don't know if you're capable of that." He said, "You don't think I can. I think you've never had a reason to try." "You're a reason." Her expression didn't shift. "You didn't think so on Tuesday." He had no answer for that either. He sat across from her in the lamplight and felt, in a way he had not felt since he was very young, that he was in a room where his usual tools didn't work. No leverage, no exit, just the bare fact of what he'd said, and the woman sitting across from him who had heard it and had spent 4 days deciding what to do with it, and had arrived at something he couldn't fully read. She stood up. She picked up her book. She said, "I'm not leaving, Damien. I want you to know that. I'm not going anywhere." She paused at the door. "But I'm also not going back to what we were. That's not on the table anymore." He said, "What does that mean?" She looked at him. "It means I replaced my love for you." The sentence hit him somewhere low and central, below the sternum, in a place that didn't have defenses because he'd never thought it needed them. She wasn't angry when she said it. That was the worst part. She wasn't crying. She wasn't trembling with the effort of restraint. She was simply clear. The way people are clear when they've passed through pain and arrived at the other side and found something they didn't expect to find there. He said nothing. She left. He sat alone in the room for a long time after. The clock ticked. The wind moved. He picked up the glass she'd left on the table and held it in his hands, which were, for the first time in his adult memory, not quite steady. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in the room that was technically theirs but felt, increasingly, like a shared space between two people who had agreed on the furniture and nothing else, and stared at the ceiling and did what he almost never did. He thought backward. He thought about the first year, when she'd restructured her entire professional life to accommodate his schedule without once asking him to acknowledge it. He'd noticed it at the time. He noticed most things, and filed it under. She's adapting. She's adjusting. This is what people do. He thought about the winter Eleanor got sick. He'd been in Boston for 4 days. He came home and Eleanor was recovering and Victoria looked like she hadn't slept properly in a week, and he had said, he could hear it now with a clarity that felt almost punishing. He had said, "Good. You handled it well," and turned back to his phone. "You handled it well." As though it were a task she'd been assigned. As though his mother were a logistical problem she'd been deployed to solve. He thought about every charity event where he'd put his hand on her back for the cameras, and felt, in some part of himself, that he hadn't examined closely enough, a small and functional satisfaction. She looked good beside him. She made the right impression. She was, in the language his mind reached for most readily, an asset. He thought about Tuesday night and the specific way he'd said those words, not in anger, not even in thoughtlessness, exactly, just fact, assessment. She's easy to replace anyway. And the more he lay there in the dark, the more he understood that the cruelty of it was not in the saying. It was in how long he had been thinking it. He got up at 2 a.m. and went to the kitchen. He stood in the dark and made coffee. He didn't want, Badly, the proportions wrong, the way they were always wrong when he did it himself, and he stood at the counter and drank it in the dark, and felt something he had not felt in 20 years of building a life on the certainty that he was always the most controlled person in any room. He felt afraid. Not the operational fear he knew, the clean, adrenaline-edged alertness that came before dangerous situations. That fear sharpened him. He knew how to use it. This was different. This was the fear of having lost something before you understood it was there, of reaching for a thing and finding the space where it used to be, of knowing with the low dread of someone who has spent 20 years reading situations accurately that the woman in the room down the hall was telling him the truth. She had replaced her love for him. And he did not know when it had happened, which meant he had not been paying attention, which meant he had been the kind of man who deserved exactly this kind of waking up. The next morning, Marcus arrived early to confirm the schedule for the following week. He came to the back entrance, the way the staff did, and Victoria was already in the kitchen, and Damien stood in the doorway to the hallway just far enough back that he could see without being immediately visible. He watched Marcus set down his jacket on the chair by the door. He watched Victoria look up and say, without any preamble, "How'd the exam go?" Marcus stopped. Something crossed his face, surprise, and then something softer underneath it. "Better than I thought, actually. Passed it." "Marcus." Her voice went warm and real. "I knew you would." "I almost didn't. My kid was up sick 2 nights before. I was running on nothing." "But you did it." "Yeah." He shook his head with the particular sheepishness of someone not entirely sure how to receive being cared about. "Yeah, I did." She smiled. It was the same smile Damien had seen at charity events, at family dinners, across the breakfast table, but it landed differently here, in the ordinary light of the kitchen, aimed at a man who drove cars for a living and had passed a test while his kid was sick. It landed like it was for him specifically and no one else. Damien stood in the doorway. He thought, "I have lived in this house for 15 years, and I do not know if Marcus has children. I did not know he was studying. I did not know because I did not ask." He thought, she asks, she always asks, and she remembers, and she follows up. He thought, I called her replaceable. Marcus glanced toward the doorway and caught Damien there, and for a moment the three of them existed in the same space. The driver with his jacket on the chair, the wife with her coffee cup, the man in the doorway who had just understood something about himself that would take a long time to fully reckon with. Damien said, "Congratulations. On the exam." Marcus blinked. "Thank you, sir." The words felt strange in Damien's mouth. Not insincere, just unfamiliar, like a phrase in a language he'd studied years ago and let go rusty. He walked out. Behind him, he heard Victoria say something quiet to Marcus. He didn't catch the words. He didn't need to. He walked to his office and sat at his desk and pulled the Marcello file, the same one he'd asked for Tuesday night, the one that had come right after those 4 words, and set it on the desk in front of him and did not open it. He sat there with the file closed and the morning light coming through the windows and the particular silence of a man who has looked honestly at himself for the first time in a long time and found the view genuinely unacceptable. He thought, I have to change. Not to win her back. He wasn't sure that was possible. He wasn't sure he deserved for it to be possible. But because the man he'd caught a clear picture of last night, the man who filed people under functions and spoke about his wife's replaceability to lieutenants in a lit office on a rainy Tuesday, that man was not who he had intended to become. He didn't know yet how far back he had to go to find where he'd gone wrong. He suspected it was further than he was ready to look. But he opened his desk drawer and took out a notepad. Something he almost never used. Everything in his life was digital and efficient and archived. And he wrote down one name, Marcus. He stared at it. Then he wrote a second one, Ramon. He put the pen down. He thought about what Victoria had said. Thought about the specific word she'd chosen. That precise and terrible word. Replaced. He picked the pen back up and wrote, in his own handwriting, in the silence of an office where 4 days ago he had casually destroyed something he was only beginning to understand the value of. She didn't replace what she did. She replaced what she felt. He looked at that sentence for a long time. Then he closed the notepad and pressed both hands flat on his desk and understood with the complete and undefended clarity of a man who can no longer lie to himself that he was standing at the edge of something. And the edge was entirely his own fault. He changed the small things first because he didn't know how to change the large ones. The notepad became a habit, not something anyone saw. He kept it in the top right drawer of his desk, under a folder marked with a project code that no one on his team would open without clearance. Small notes. Reminders to himself that felt almost embarrassing in their simplicity. Ramon's son. Follow-up appointment, 3rd week of the month. Petra's mother. Ask about the festival. Marcus. Associate degree, 1 class left. He started showing up to breakfast earlier. Not conspicuously. He didn't want it to look like performance, partly because he knew Victoria would see through performance immediately, and partly because he was trying, with some difficulty, to figure out the difference between changing and pretending to change. He wasn't entirely sure he knew where that line was. He'd spent so many years being strategic about everything that sincerity felt like a foreign language he was translating in his head before speaking. The first morning he arrived early enough to overlap with Eleanor. She looked at him over her tea with the expression of a woman recalibrating an expectation. She said, "You're up." He said, "I live here." She smiled at that, small, dry. "So you do." He sat down. He poured himself coffee, still wrong, still not quite right, and he asked his mother about the book she'd been reading. Not because he cared about the book, because she did, and he had spent 15 years caring about her in a practical, logistical way, while never once sitting across from her at a breakfast table and asking what she was reading. Eleanor told him about the book for 11 minutes. He timed it without meaning to, old habit, always tracking duration in conversations, and then stopped tracking it and just listened. It wasn't nothing. Victoria noticed. Of course she noticed. She was a woman who had been paying close attention to the texture of this household for 8 years. But she didn't comment on it, and she didn't soften. That was the part Damien hadn't fully accounted for in his private, half-formed idea of how this might go. Some part of him, the part that was still accustomed to cause and effect, to effort-producing results, had assumed that visible change would produce visible response, that she would see him trying and the temperature between them would shift. It didn't. She was not cold. She was not punishing him. She simply continued being exactly what she had become since Tuesday night, present in her own life, attentive to the people around her, and calibrated entirely away from him in the specific way that a person recalibrates when they've stopped waiting for something. She had stopped waiting. That was what he was slowly understanding, and you could not make a person start waiting again just by showing up. You could only show up and keep showing up, and accept that the waiting might be gone for good. He was trying to accept that. He wasn't doing it well, but he was trying. 3 weeks in, the Castellano situation fractured. It had been building for months, a territorial dispute along the waterfront that Damien had been managing through a combination of financial pressure and strategic patience. The Castellanos were an old family with old habits, and old families responded to patience better than force. He'd been counting on another 4 to 6 weeks before they moved towards settlement. They didn't give him 4 to 6 weeks. On a Thursday morning, Caruso came to the office with his jacket still damp from the rain and his face arranged in the expression he used when news was bad enough to deliver in person. He said, "The Castellanos hit the Harmon Street operation last night." Damien put down his coffee. "How bad?" "3 men in the hospital. Not critical, but..." Caruso set a folder on the desk. "They're making a statement. They want to see how you respond." He looked at the folder without opening it. His mind was already moving through the geometry of it, pressure points, response options, what message each choice sent, how the other families would read whatever he did next. This was the machinery he'd built his life inside, and it ran cleanly even when the rest of his life felt like it had gone sideways. "Call Reyes," he said. "Tell him I want a meeting, not a message, a meeting, tonight if possible." Reyes is Castellano adjacent. "I know who Reyes is, that's why I want the meeting." He stood up. "If the Castellanos wanted war, they'd have done more damage. This is a signal. I want to know what they're actually asking for before I respond." Caruso nodded once and left. Damien stood behind his desk and pressed both palms flat on the surface and breathed through the operational clarity that always came when real stakes arrived. The way some men get calm in emergencies because emergencies have rules and rules are easier than people. He thought, "I cannot be distracted right now." He thought, "I have been distracted for 3 weeks." He thought, and this one surprised him with its honesty, "Those were the best 3 weeks I have had in years." The meeting with Reyes happened at 11 that night, in a restaurant in Midtown that Reyes kept for exactly this kind of conversation. Damien arrived with Caruso and one other man, which was itself a signal. He could have arrived with 6. He arrived with 2. Reyes was 57 years old and had the particular weathered elegance of someone who had spent his adult life adjacent to violence without ever being its primary instrument. He was useful precisely because he talked to everyone and was owned by no one, which made him expensive and reliable in equal measure. He shook Damien's hand and looked at him with the careful, reading expression of a man who made his living on accurate assessments. He said, "You look tired." Damien said, "Tell me what the Castellanos want." Reyes poured wine for both of them. Damien didn't touch his. Reyes noted that and poured his own and said, "They want the Meridian contract. That's not available." "They know that. That's not actually what they want." Reyes turned the glass in his hands. "What they want is to know that you're still paying attention. There's been talk. People who like to talk have been saying that Blackwood is—" He paused, chose the word carefully, "distracted. Internally." Damien was very still. "What kind of talk?" he said. "The kind that spreads when men feel like the center isn't holding." Reyes met his eyes without apology. "That was what you paid him for, the unfiltered version. You've been different. People in your organization notice things. The Castellanos heard the noticing and decided to test it. Who's spreading it? Does it matter right now?" "It always matters." Reyes said a name. Damien looked at the table for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was a long time for him to look at a table. "You're certain?" "I'm certain enough to be sitting here telling you." He picked up the wine he hadn't intended to drink and took a slow mouthful and set it back down and said nothing for a moment, because the name Reyes had said was the name of a man he had trusted for 6 years, a man who had been in his office on a Tuesday night 3 weeks ago, a man who had been in the room when he'd said those 4 words to the empty air. Not empty air. With an audience of 2. And one of them had apparently decided that Damien Blackwood's domestic situation was useful currency. He said, "I'll handle the Castellanos. Give them the Meridian consultation. Not the contract, the consultation. It's a gesture, not a concession. Make sure they understand the difference." Reyes nodded. "The other thing," Damien said, and his voice had gone to the register he used for decisions that didn't require volume, "I'll handle personally." He handled it the next morning. The man's name was Tavio. He was 38, sharp, ambitious in the particular way of men who believe that proximity to power entitles them to some of it. Damien had promoted him twice in 6 years, had trusted him with the kind of information that trust is supposed to protect. Damien called him into the office at 9. He did not offer him a seat. He stood behind his desk, which he sometimes did when he wanted the geometry to say something without words. He said, "You talked." Tavio's face did the thing faces do when they're deciding how much they've been caught. "I don't know what—" "Don't." Damien's voice was very even. "Don't do the part where you don't know what I'm talking about. It wastes both of our time, and I'm not patient today." Tavio was quiet. "What I said in this office 3 weeks ago," Damien said, "about my wife. You took that outside." "I wasn't trying to—" "You weren't trying to what?" "Damage my standing. Destabilize my position. Give the Castellanos a reason to hit Harmon Street." He paused. "Which one of those things were you not trying to do?" "I was having a conversation. It went further than I intended." "It always does." Damien came around the desk. Not quickly. He moved the way he always moved, measured, deliberate, giving the other person time to understand what was coming. "You took something private, something that happened in my home that involved my wife, and you used it as currency." He stopped in front of Tavio. "I want to understand why." "Damien, tell me why." Tavio's jaw was tight. "I was a man used to being in rooms with dangerous people, but there was something different about being in a room with a man you'd betrayed who was currently looking at you with zero emotion and complete attention." He said, "I thought things were changing. I thought there was room, maybe, for—" "For what? For you?" Silence. "You thought I was losing my grip," Damien said. "You thought there was an opening." He nodded slowly. "I understand the thinking. It's the same thinking I would have had at your age." He stepped back, picked up the phone on his desk. "Caruso." Caruso answered on the first ring. Damien said, "Come get Tavio. He's done." He hung up and looked at Tavio for a moment. Something in his chest was very tight and very quiet. He said, "You didn't hurt me. I want you to understand that. Whatever you told people, whatever they did with it, that's manageable." He paused. What you did to my wife, using something I said about her, spreading it so that her name is in conversations it doesn't belong in. That is not something I forgive." Tavio opened his mouth. Damien said, "We're done talking." Caruso appeared in the door 12 seconds later. Tavio left without further argument. It was many things, but he was not stupid, and he could read the specific finality in a room. When the door closed, Damien stood alone. He thought about what Tavio had said, that things were changing, that there was room, that from the outside, looking at the last 3 weeks of a man learning to ask his mother what she was reading and writing names in a notepad, the view had read as weakness. He thought, it probably was weakness. And he thought, I don't actually care. That afternoon, Victoria came to find him. This was new. In 3 weeks of shift and recalibration, she had not sought him out. He'd always been the one to navigate toward her, careful as a man crossing ice that might or might not hold. She found him in the library, standing at the window, which was apparently becoming a habit. She said, I heard there was a situation. It's handled. Eleanor heard from Caruso's wife. He turned from the window. I said it's handled. She studied him. He was used to her looking at him. In 8 years of marriage, you accumulate a significant inventory of someone looking at you. But she was looking at him differently lately, with the eyes of someone who has recalibrated their assessment criteria and is still collecting data. She said, Is it something serious? It was. It isn't now. He paused. Tavio was talking about things he shouldn't have talked about. I addressed it. She was very still. What things? He met her eyes. Things about us. About what's been different these past few weeks. He thought it meant something that it didn't mean. Other people took an interest. She absorbed this. He watched her absorb it, the slight change in her breathing, the stillness that settled over her that wasn't shock exactly, more like the recognition of something she'd suspected. She said, They know. Some people know something. It's been managed. Damien, her voice was careful, if people in your world know there's tension between us, if they think you're distracted, if they think you're... I'm not. He said it firmly, not to reassure her, but because it was true. Whatever Tavio said, whatever the Castellanos thought they were testing, I'm not distracted in the ways that matter operationally. He paused. I'm distracted in ways that are personal. That's different. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something he hadn't expected. Are you in danger? He hadn't anticipated the question. Not because it was unusual in his world. The question of danger was basically ambient, background noise, but because she was asking it, because she was standing in the library with her arms crossed and her eyes on him, and she was asking if he was safe. He said, No. You'd tell me. Yes. She held his gaze for another few seconds, checking it the way you check something you're not entirely sure you can trust. Then she nodded, once, and turned to leave. At the door she stopped. She didn't turn around. She said to the doorframe, I don't want anything to happen to you. A pause. I want you to know that. I don't want to be here and have something happen to you. He said nothing. She left. He stood in the library and thought about the difference between love and the residue of love, between caring about a person and loving them, between not wanting someone to be hurt and wanting to be the one who stands beside them. He thought Victoria might be drawing those distinctions herself, somewhere in the room down the hall. He thought, she doesn't want me dead. He thought, that's not nothing. He thought, it's also not enough. The call came at 11:15 that night. Damien was still up. He'd been reviewing the Castellano resolution documents, a clean enough outcome that he didn't trust entirely, clean outcomes in this business being somewhat like unusually good weather. And when his personal line rang with a number he didn't recognize, he answered on the second ring. A woman's voice said, Mr. Blackwood. Who is this? My name is Dr. Miriam Walsh. I'm calling from Lenox Hill Hospital. A pause that had the specific weight of medical pauses. We have Eleanor Blackwood admitted as of 40 minutes ago. She had a cardiac event at home. One of your staff called the ambulance. Another pause. She's stable. I want to be clear. She is stable, but she's asking for Victoria. He was already moving before the doctor finished the sentence. He knocked on Victoria's door. Unnecessary. She was awake. He could see the light under the door, but he knocked. She opened it in 30 seconds. She was still dressed, which meant she'd been sitting up. Her face when she saw his expression went through several changes very quickly, ending on something controlled and ready. He said, Eleanor, Lenox Hill, cardiac event. She's stable. She's asking for you. Victoria picked up her jacket from the chair beside the door. She said, "Car's out front?" Marcus is already pulling around. She nodded and moved past him down the hallway with the quick, purposeful stride of a woman who has sat with frightened people before and knows how to get to them fast. In the car, they didn't speak. Marcus drove with the efficient urgency of someone who understood what the situation required. Victoria sat beside Damien in the back seat with her hands in her lap, and twice he saw her jaw tighten and release. Working through something privately, the way she worked through things, internally, without burdening other people with the process. He said quietly, "She's stable." The doctor was clear. Victoria said, "I know, I heard you." A beat. "She was alone when it happened." He said nothing. "I was down the hall," Victoria said. Petra was still in the west wing. Someone heard her fall. She turned to look out the window at the city going past, bright and indifferent. "I don't know if she called out. I don't know if she was trying to reach someone." Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. He reached over without thinking and covered both her hands with one of his. She didn't move away. She didn't move toward him. She sat very still under his hand for a moment, and he felt her hand stop moving, and she kept her face turned toward the window. That was all. That was the whole of it. But it was the first time in 3 weeks that she had let him be close, and it had not been planned, had not been strategic, had not been Damian Blackwood applying the right pressure to the right place at the right time. It had been reflex. Human and unguarded and utterly outside the machinery he'd spent 20 years building and operating. He thought, maybe that's the difference. He didn't move his hand yet. Eleanor was in a room on the 4th floor, connected to monitors that beeped with the officious regularity of machines that are keeping score. She looked smaller than she did at home. That was the first thing. The bed and the lights and the equipment reduced her somehow, shrank the fierce and difficult woman into something that looked like what she actually was, which was a 73-year-old person whose heart had stuttered on a Thursday night. She was awake. Her eyes found Victoria the second the door opened, and something in her face, something that had been held very tightly, loosened. She said, "You came." Victoria crossed the room and took her hand. She said, "Of course I came. They wanted to give me something to sleep." Eleanor's voice was scratchy and slightly indignant. "I told them to wait. You should sleep. I wanted to see you first." Her eyes moved to Damien, standing at the foot of the bed. The look she gave him was complicated. The look of a woman who is frightened and angry and loves her son and is disappointed in him, simultaneously, without any of those things canceling the others out. She said, "You're here." He said, "I'm here." "Good." Her hand tightened on Victoria's. "Both of you, then." She settled back against the pillow. "I want to tell you something." Victoria said, "Eleanor, you need to rest." "I'll rest after." Her voice was thin but exact. "I've been lying in this room for 40 minutes thinking about what I haven't said out loud, and I'm old enough to know that there are things you should say out loud and things you shouldn't wait on." She looked at her son. "I am not going to tell you how to be married. You're 42 years old, but I'm going to tell you this." She took a breath. "The night I was sick, 2 winters ago. Your wife stayed with me for 4 days. She slept in that chair." She gestured, apparently toward an imaginary chair in an imaginary room, "because I didn't want to be alone and I was too proud to say so. She said it for me. She understood it before I said it." Her eyes were very steady. "I don't know what's happened between you. I don't need to know. But I know what kind of woman she is. And I know what kind of man you've been." Her voice was dry and tired and entirely without performance. "Be better." The monitors beeped. Victoria's thumb moved over Eleanor's hand. Damien stood at the foot of the bed and felt the accumulated weight of everything he had failed to say, and failed to notice, and failed to understand pressing down on the back of his neck, and he did not move, and he did not look away. Eleanor said, "Now you can give me the thing to sleep." Victoria reached for the call button. Damien sat down in the chair beside the bed, the chair that Eleanor didn't know she was referencing, the imaginary one that Victoria had apparently made real and sat in for 4 days while Eleanor was frightened and he was in Boston. And he sat there while his mother's eyes closed, and Victoria sat across from him on the other side of the bed, and neither of them spoke, and the monitors kept score. At some point after midnight, he looked up and found Victoria watching him with an expression he could not fully read. Not closed, not open. Somewhere in between, the way a door is sometimes left not quite latched, not an invitation, and not a refusal.
He said very quietly, "I didn't know about the chair." She said, "I know you didn't." He said,
I should have known. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were tired and entirely clear, and she said, so quietly that the monitors almost swallowed it, "Yes, you should have." And in the silence after that, something between them settled into a new shape. Not fixed, not healed, but different from what it had been, in the way that things change shape when they've been through enough pressure, and the pressure has finally, definitively stopped pretending to be anything other than what it is. He thought about the notepad in his desk drawer, the names, the small, embarrassing, entirely sincere effort of a man who had looked at himself honestly and found the image unacceptable and started trying to be different without any certainty that different was still something she would want. He thought it might not be enough. He thought, "I'm going to try anyway." He folded his hands in his lap and sat in the hospital chair and did not try to manage the silence, and the room held both of them, and his mother breathed. And the night moved forward the way nights move when the thing you were afraid to look at has finally been looked at, and the looking, though it cost you, has left you. Not destroyed, not redeemed, but stripped down to something that might finally be real enough to build on. Eleanor came home on a Sunday. She came home thinner, which she hated, and slower on the stairs, which she hated more, and with a list of dietary restrictions from the cardiologist that she described, loudly, as an insult to her intelligence. She read the list once in the car, folded it precisely, and handed it to Victoria without comment. Victoria put it in her jacket pocket without comment. That was the whole exchange. It contained, in its silence, the entire architecture of what those two women were to each other. Damien watched it from the front steps and said nothing and helped his mother up the 3 steps to the door with a hand under her elbow that she accepted, which told him more about how she was actually feeling than anything she'd said in the hospital. The house felt different when they came back into it. He couldn't name the difference precisely. Something had been rearranged. Not the furniture, not the staff, not anything visible. But that night in the hospital had moved things around in invisible ways, and the rooms knew it, even if nobody said so. He let 3 days pass before he made the next move. Not out of strategy. He was trying, with genuine and somewhat clumsy effort, to stop operating entirely in strategy when it came to his home. He let 3 days pass because Eleanor needed quiet, and Victoria needed space, and he needed to sit still long enough with what he'd understood in that hospital room to let it become something he could actually carry rather than just something he'd glimpsed. On the 4th day, he drove himself somewhere for the first time in years. He told Marcus he didn't need him. Marcus looked at him with the careful expression of a man who has been driving other people for long enough to know when something significant is happening in a back seat that no longer has a passenger, but he nodded and stepped aside. Damien drove to the Children's Hospital on the east side where Victoria volunteered. He knew about it generally. She'd been doing it for 4 years. Thursday afternoon, something to do with a pediatric literacy program she'd helped fund in the early years, and then stayed involved with past the funding. He'd never been there. He'd been invited, twice, to small events the program ran, and he'd sent checks instead of himself, which was the kind of delegation that looked like generosity and felt, in retrospect, like avoidance. He didn't announce himself. He parked in the visitor structure and walked in and asked at the desk where the pediatric volunteer program held its Thursday sessions, and followed the directions down a hallway that smelled like industrial cleaner and something sweeter underneath it, something that took him a moment to identify as the particular sugary artificial smell of juice boxes. He heard her before he saw her, not her voice specifically. He heard laughter, a child's laughter, short and delighted, the kind that happens when something is genuinely funny rather than performed funny. And then her voice underneath it, saying something he couldn't make out, and then more laughter, and then another voice, younger, saying something with great emphasis and seriousness that made the other voices respond with warmth. He stopped in the hallway before the door. He stood there for a moment, outside it, the way he'd stood outside his own office a month ago. But this time, he wasn't overhearing something that was destroying him. He was standing outside a door and trying to understand something about the woman on the other side of it that he had spent 8 years failing to understand. He pushed the door open. The room was medium-sized, fluorescent lit, with round tables and chairs sized for small people and several bulletin boards covered in drawings and handwritten pages. There were 7 children that he could count, ages ranging from maybe 5 to maybe 11, and 3 adults besides Victoria, and the entire room was in the middle of what appeared to be a loud and contested discussion about whether a fictional dragon could also be a detective. Victoria was sitting on the edge of a table, not at a table on it, which he had never seen her do, this woman who moved through formal spaces with such exact calibration, and she was listening to a small girl explain with absolute conviction why the dragon would obviously be better at solving mysteries because it could fly over the crime scene to get a better view. Victoria said, "That is actually a very good point." The small girl looked triumphant. Another child immediately protested. Victoria caught sight of Damien in the doorway. Her expression shifted. Not alarm exactly, not anger. More like the very specific disorientation of seeing something that belongs in one part of your life appear, without warning, in a completely different part. She excused herself from the table in a way that was easy and practiced, told the children she'd be right back, and walked to the doorway. She stepped into the hallway with him and pulled the door partially closed behind her. She said quietly, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I needed to see this." "See what?" "You." He looked at her. "Here. This." She studied his face for a moment. In the room behind her, the dragon detective debate continued at volume. She said, "How did you know where—" "You've told me, multiple times over the past 4 years." He paused. "I didn't listen the right way. I logged it the way I log things that don't require action." She said nothing. "I wanted to see what I logged wrong," he said. The hallway was quiet except for the children's voices behind the door. A nurse passed at the far end without looking at them. Somewhere deep in the building, a PA system said something in a tone of practiced calm. Victoria looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Stay quiet. Sit in the back. Don't make it about you." She pushed the door back open and walked inside. He followed. He sat in a chair meant for an 8-year-old, which put his knees approximately at his chest, which he endured without comment for 1 hour and 40 minutes. He watched her work. That was the only word for it. Work. Not in the way he worked, which was applied force, managed outcomes, leverage. She worked the way someone works when they are entirely focused on the person in front of them and entirely unbothered by anything else. She moved between the children with the unhurried attention of someone who had nowhere else to be, which he knew was technically false. She had approximately 11 other places to be on any given Thursday afternoon, but which her presence made feel absolutely true. A boy named Theo, 7 years old and missing one front tooth, had apparently been struggling with a story he'd been writing for 3 weeks. Victoria sat beside him for 20 minutes. Damien couldn't hear the whole conversation from the back of the room, but he caught pieces. He caught, "What does Marcus feel when he does that?" The character's name was apparently Marcus, which Damien noted with a private and complicated feeling. He caught, "You don't have to explain it, just show me what he does with his hands." He caught, "That's it, that's exactly it. Read that part again. Hear how that sounds?" Theo read the part again. Then he looked up at Victoria with the expression of someone who has just heard something they wrote sound like something real. Victoria said, "That's yours. You did that." Theo's face did something that Damien, watching from across the room on a child's chair with his knees at his chest, felt in his own body like a physical impact. Pride. Pure and undefended. A doctor came in at some point and hugged Victoria briefly. Not a formal greeting, a real hug, the kind between people who have stood beside each other through something. A mother who was waiting in the corner for her daughter looked up when Victoria crossed near her and said, simply and quietly, "She had a good day today." And Victoria stopped and turned toward the mother fully and said, "Tell me." Not as a courtesy, as a question. Damien watched all of it. He thought about efficiency, about functions, about what could be replaced. He thought, you can hire a volunteer, you can fund a program, you can send a check and attach your name to it and have the thing exist without you. You cannot hire what was happening in this room. You cannot fund it. You cannot attach your name to it and walk away and have it still be what it is. It was her. Specifically. The particular quality of her attention, her memory, her willingness to sit on a table in a fluorescent-lit hospital room and take a small girl's theory about flying detective dragons entirely seriously. It was who she was, not what she did. He had spent 8 years with the woman and called her a function. He sat in the small chair and breathed and didn't say anything, and the children's voices went around the room, and he let himself feel, without managing it, without converting it into actionable information, the full weight of what he had wasted. They walked out together at 4:30. The late afternoon light hit the sidewalk in long horizontal lines, the particular low gold of autumn in the city, and they stood outside the entrance without immediately moving toward the parking structure. Victoria said, "Well," he said, "I understand now." "What do you understand?" He looked at the street. He thought about how to say it accurately, which was harder than he'd expected, because the things he understood didn't have the kind of clean edges that language usually preferred. He said, "You built something, in there, in the house, everywhere you go." He paused. "You built something that actually works, that makes people feel real, valued." He stopped, started again. "I looked at that and called it efficiency. I looked at you and called it useful." His voice was level, but it cost him. "I was wrong about what I was looking at." She listened. "I was wrong," he said again. "Not about one thing on one night, about what I spent 8 years treating you as." She was quiet for a moment. The street noise went around them. Cabs, a distant siren, someone's phone playing music as they passed. She said, "Why are you telling me this here?" "Because I should have seen it here a long time ago, and I didn't. It seemed right to say it in the place where I finally did." She looked at him with that expression he was learning to read. Not open, not closed, something in between that meant she was processing something real rather than performing a reaction. She said, "Damien." He waited. "What you're doing, the names, the questions, whatever it is you've been doing these past weeks." She stopped. "I see it. I want you to know that. I'm not unaware of it." He said, But seeing it isn't the same as feeling something from it. Not yet." Her voice was entirely honest. "I don't know if yet is even the right word. I don't know what I feel. I know I'm watching. I know I notice." She looked down the street. "I know that you sitting in a room full of 7-year-olds on a chair that was probably deeply uncomfortable for almost 2 hours without once pulling out your phone." She almost smiled. Almost. "I noticed that." He said, "The chair was terrible." She said, "I know. I've sat in it." Something passed between them that wasn't quite warm and wasn't quite not. Small, survivable, real. She started toward the parking structure. He walked beside her. The second blow came 6 days later. He should have seen it coming. In retrospect, the signs were there in the Castellano resolution, in the careful way Reyes had handed over certain information and withheld other information, in the speed with which the waterfront situation had settled. Too clean, too fast. The kind of resolution that in his experience always meant something was being traded that you didn't know you were trading yet. I was in his office at 8 in the morning when Caruso called, not texted, which was always the signal. "Talk," Damien said. Caruso said, "Lorenzo Castellano is calling a sit-down, not with you, with the other families." A pause. "He's putting together a case that you're compromised." "On what grounds?" "Emotional instability, divided attention, uncharacteristic behavior over the past month." Caruso's voice was neutral and precise. "Tavio's been more vocal than we thought. What he spread didn't stay where we thought it stayed." Damien put his phone down on the desk, on speaker, and pressed both palms flat. "He's specifically saying," Caruso continued, "that your wife has destabilized your decision-making, that the household situation is affecting operations." Another pause. "Meridian, Harmon Street, the delay on the Reyes negotiation. He's packaging it as evidence." "None of those things are connected to, I know that, you know that. Lorenzo Castellano doesn't care what's actually connected to what. He needs a narrative, and he has the pieces of one." Damien picked up the phone. "When's the sit-down?" "He's trying to schedule it for next week. He hasn't confirmed a location yet." "Who's he talking to?" Caruso named 3 families. Damien went through the geometry of it fast and cold. Relationships, leverage, debts owed, and outstanding. Who would listen to Lorenzo and who would wait for him. 2 of the 3 families were genuinely persuadable. 1 would wait for the wind. "I need to move first," he said. "I know. Get me Fontaine, tonight if possible." Fontaine was the eldest of the 3 families, old enough to remember Damien's father and consider the Blackwood name a matter of history rather than just current events. "And get me the Harmon Street numbers. Clean numbers, not the processed ones. I want to show him exactly what those operations look like." "Already pulling them." He hung up. He sat for exactly 30 seconds and let himself feel the specific, pressurized rage of a man who has been patient and careful and had those qualities used against him, who has been trying to become something better and watched someone else pick up that effort and point it at him like a weapon. Then he stood up and went to work.
The next 4 days were the kind of days his life used to be made entirely of. 18-hour stretches.
Multiple simultaneous conversations, some in rooms and some on encrypted lines and some through intermediaries who relayed messages with the careful, precise inaccuracy of people who understood that the exact words mattered. He met Fontaine for dinner on a Tuesday and spent 3 hours walking him through the actual operational record of the last 2 months, clean and documented, and watched the old man's face move through skepticism and into something more like respect. Fontaine said, over dessert he didn't eat. Lorenzo's ambitious. Damien said, yes. His father was ambitious too. Fontaine moved his spoon through the untouched tiramisu. His father also reached further than his arms were long, twice, and both times someone had to recalibrate him. He looked up. I was one of those people, the second time. Damien waited. I'm not in the business of recalibrating young men anymore, Fontaine said. I'm too old and it's tedious. He put the spoon down. But I'm also not going to sit in Lorenzo Castellano's meeting and listen to him try to dismantle something that took 30 years to build because of gossip about a man's marriage. He signaled for the check. Sort your house, he said to Damien. Not unkindly. Whatever the actual situation is, sort it. Not because of Lorenzo. Because a man who runs things the way you run things should not have his private life used as a question mark. He left. Damien sat alone at the table for a moment. He thought about what sort your house meant, and whether it was as simple as the old man had made it sound, and whether it was even possible to sort something when the sorting required the agreement of a person who hadn't decided yet whether the sorting was something she wanted. He thought about Victoria. He thought, she doesn't know any of this. He thought, I have to tell her. He came home at midnight. The house was quiet, and the way it got late at night, that particular stillness that was different from daytime quiet, more complete. He checked on Eleanor's room out of habit. Door closed, no light under it, which was good. He walked to the kitchen because he needed water and found Victoria there. She was at the counter with a mug of something, and she looked like she'd been sitting there for a while, not reading, not on her phone, just sitting. She looked up when he came in. He said, You're up. She said, So are you. He got his water. He stood on the other side of the counter from her and said, I need to tell you something. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Okay, he told her. He gave her the shape of it. Tavio, Lorenzo, the sit-down, his name being moved around rooms as a question mark, and at the center of it, the specific allegation, her name attached to his instability, her presence in his life described as a liability by men who had never been in the same room with her. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said, They're using me as the argument against you. Yes. Because of what's changed, how I've been different. In their reading, different means weak. He set down the glass. I want you to know that I'm aware of how that sounds, that the people who benefit from us having problems are now using those problems. I understand what you could do with that information. She looked at him. What could I do with it? You could say this is exactly why. Why this life? Why this world? Why any of it is... He stopped. You have grounds. Grounds for what? For leaving. He said it flatly. Clean grounds. You could walk out of here with your name intact, the marriage destroyed by his world's politics. Nobody to blame but the situation. He paused. I'm not suggesting it. I'm telling you it exists. She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was very quiet. She said, Why are you telling me that? Because you should know your options. All of them. He met her eyes. I spent 8 years not making sure you knew your options. I'm not doing that again. Something crossed her face that he couldn't entirely read. A movement, quick and complex, like light changing. She said, What are you going to do about Lorenzo? Handle it. How? The way I handle things. He paused, carefully, without collateral damage where I can avoid it. She nodded slowly. She looked down at her mug. She said, You know what Fontaine meant when he said sort your house? Yes. He meant me. He meant us. She was quiet again. He watched her sit with it, the particular self-contained way she processed things, that internal stillness that he used to mistake for acceptance, and now understood was something more active than that, more like deliberate weight-bearing. She said, I'm not a problem to be managed, Damien. I know. I'm not a liability that needs to be neutralized so your business runs cleaner. I know that. Whatever happens between us, she looked up. It happens because it happens, not because Lorenzo Castellano is inconvenient. Yes, he said it without hesitation. She held his gaze. Then she stood up and took her mug to the sink and rinsed it, her back to him, and he stood at the counter and said nothing. She said to the sink, "What's Fontaine going to do?" "Stay out of Lorenzo's meeting." "And the others?" "Two are uncertain."
"One will follow whoever looks stronger by the end of the week." She turned off the water. She turned around. She leaned against the counter with her arms crossed, and her eyes on him with the complete, clear attention she gave to things that mattered to her. She said, "You're not going to that meeting as a man whose household is in crisis." He said, "No, I'm not." "You're going as someone whose house is sorted." He looked at her. She held his eyes. She said, "I'll be there, wherever the meeting is, whatever format it needs to take." Her voice was steady and entirely serious. "Not because you need me as an asset, not because it's efficient. A beat. Because that man down the hall sat in a chair made for a 7-year-old for 2 hours and didn't check his phone once." She unfolded her arms. "And because Eleanor needs to come home to something that doesn't feel like a disaster." He said, "Victoria." She said, "Don't thank me. I'm not doing it for thanks." She moved toward the door. "And Damien." She stopped but didn't turn around. "When this is over, when Lorenzo is handled and the families have decided and all of it settles." She paused. "We talk. Really talk. Not crisis management. Not logistics." Her shoulders moved slightly, something too small to be called a breath. "There are things I still need to say to you, and there are things I need to hear from you, and I need to know whether what I hear is still true a month from now, or a year." He said, "I'll be here." She said, "You say that now." She walked out. He stood in the kitchen alone, and the house was quiet all around him, and outside through the window the city was doing what cities do at midnight, relentless, lit, indifferent to the specific weight of the man standing in the kitchen of the Blackwood estate, trying to understand whether he had just been given something or been told what it would cost to earn something. He thought, both. He thought, the cost is fair. He moved to the window. He stood in the dark kitchen of his father's house and thought about everything that was going to happen in the next 72 hours, the moves he needed to make, the conversations required, the careful and dangerous work of holding an empire together when someone had decided to test its edges. And underneath all of that, threading through every calculation like something that couldn't be filed or delegated or managed into quietness, the specific way she'd said, "We talk." Not "we'll talk." We talk. Present tense, as though she was already somewhere in herself beginning to decide. He pressed his hand flat against the cold window glass. He thought, "Don't lose this." He thought, "For once in your life, do not lose this." And the city outside went on burning with its own light, and the clock on the kitchen wall ticked toward morning, and somewhere in this house the two women who had already survived every version of him were sleeping, and tomorrow the work of becoming someone who deserved that survival would begin again, harder than before, with higher stakes and less room for error and the whole weight of every choice he'd made pressing down on the moment he was still standing inside, not yet ready to move, but almost ready. He didn't sleep. He stood at the kitchen window until 2 in the morning, then moved to the library, then stood at that window for a while, then sat at his desk with the notepad open in front of him, the same notepad, the one with the names, and looked at the list he'd built over the past month and thought about everything it represented and everything it didn't. At 3:15, he started writing something different, not names, not reminders. He started writing, in his careful, cramped handwriting that nobody ever saw, the actual sequence of what had happened, starting from Tuesday night and the coffee and the 4 words, going forward through every conversation, every silence, every moment in the hospital room and the children's ward and the kitchen at midnight. He wrote it out the way he used to reconstruct failed operations, completely, without self-serving edits, looking for the moments where different choices would have produced different outcomes. He filled 6 pages. Then he read them back. He was not a sentimental man. He'd spent 20 years removing sentimentality from his decision-making as a professional discipline. But sitting at his desk at 3:30 in the morning, reading 6 pages of his own marriage in his own handwriting, he felt something move through him that had no clean operational category. Grief, maybe. Not the acute kind. The long, accumulated kind. The kind that builds up quietly behind everything else, and announces itself only when you've finally stopped moving fast enough to outrun it. He closed the notepad. He put it back in the drawer.
He went to bed and lay on his back and stared at the ceiling and thought, tomorrow. Morning arrived gray and cold, the particular November cold that comes with the first suggestion of real winter behind it. He was up before 6, showered, dressed, downstairs before anyone else. He made the coffee badly, the way he always made it, and drank it at the counter standing up. And when Victoria came downstairs at 6:45, she stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating how early they need to be awake to have the house to themselves. He said, "I made extra." She looked at the coffee pot. She crossed to it and poured herself a cup and took a sip, and her expression adjusted slightly. Not complaint, not gratitude, just the faint recalibration of someone who has drunk very good coffee for 8 years and is now drinking something merely adequate. He said, "I know." She said, "It's fine." He said, "It's not. I can never get the proportion right." She held the cup. She said, "You pull too much from the grind. It makes it thin." He looked at her. "You've never told me that." "You never made it when I was around to see." A pause. She drank the thin coffee. He drank his own. She said, "What time do you need to leave today?" 9. Caruso and I are meeting Fontaine's man at 10, then moving to the other two families in the afternoon. He set down his cup. "It'll be long." She nodded. "I'll make sure Eleanor's settled before you go. She has her follow-up with the cardiologist at 2. I'll take her." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." Her voice was even, not sharp. "I want to. She'd rather go with me than with a driver." She paused. "She'd rather go with you, actually, but you'll be busy." He looked at her. "I could rearrange." "Don't!" She shook her head slightly. "Handle what you need to handle. We'll be fine." She moved past him toward the hallway. At the door she stopped, her back to him, and said, "The cardiologist's name is Dr. Mehta. She's good. Eleanor doesn't like her yet because Eleanor doesn't like anyone new until they've proven themselves 3 separate times. But she's good." She paused. "In case you want to know her name." He said, "Dr. Mehta." "Yes." She walked out. He stood at the counter with his thin coffee and thought that this was what the actual texture of change felt like. Not dramatic, not cinematic, not the kind of moment that announces itself. Just a woman telling you the name of your mother's cardiologist because you should know it. Just the specific, quiet weight of being included in your own life by someone who had every reason to exclude you. He finished the coffee. He went to get ready. The meetings took 11 hours. He'd expected long. He hadn't entirely expected the specific texture of long, the way 3 separate conversations in 3 separate locations across a cold November day could each carry their own distinct pressure, their own particular demand for steadiness, and how the steadiness had to come from somewhere real, because men who spent their lives reading other men could identify the performed version inside of 60 seconds. Fontaine's representative was a lawyer named Greer, who had been with the family for decades and communicated almost exclusively through implication. He spent an hour telling Damien, without ever saying it directly, that Fontaine's patience with Lorenzo Castellano had reached its structural limits, and that the old man's decision to remove himself from the proposed meeting should be understood as a signal rather than an absence. He drank his sparkling water and straightened his cuffs, and implied several things that would have required 3 additional conversations to be said aloud, and Damien received all of it and confirmed, through his own carefully calibrated responses, that he understood. The second family was harder. The Morrises were 3rd generation, newer to the table than Fontaine and their current head, a woman in her 50s named Constance, who had stepped into the role after her husband's death 2 years prior and had been doing it better than he had, was interested less in history and more in current operational reality. She asked direct questions. Damien answered them directly. She asked about Harmon Street. He gave her the numbers Caruso had pulled. She asked about the Meridian situation. He explained the decision trail without self-justification, just sequence and rationale. At the end, she said, "People talk. You know that." He said, "I know. Talk is usually 50% accurate at best. I generally wait to see what the other 50% actually is before I make decisions." She stood up, which was the signal. "I'll be watching how this resolves. Not how you tell me it resolves. How it actually resolves." He said, "That's fair." She walked him to the door herself, which was its own signal. He took it. The 3rd family was the one that would follow the wind, and by the time he arrived for that conversation, the wind had already shifted enough that the meeting lasted 40 minutes and ended with handshakes. Not warm handshakes, business-like ones, but present. He got in the car at 8:15. Marcus drove him home. The city was doing its evening thing, lights coming on, traffic thickening, and then thinning in patterns that had their own logic. And he sat in the back seat and felt the 11 hours settle into his shoulders and thought about Lorenzo Castellano, who by now would know that his meeting had lost 2 of its 3 intended attendees before it ever happened. He thought, it won't be over. Men like Lorenzo don't retreat, they reposition. There will be another angle. He thought, there is always another angle. That's the nature of the life. But not today. Today it held. When he got home, the lights were on in the east sitting room. He could see them from the driveway before Marcus even stopped the car, the warm yellow of the lamp she always used, visible through the window. He sat in the car for a moment after Marcus pulled up. Marcus said, "We're here, sir." He said, "I know, thank you." A pause. "Marcus, how's the last class going?" Silence from the front seat. The particular silence of someone genuinely surprised. Marcus said, "Good. Going well. Finals in 3 weeks. Let me know." He opened the door. "I mean it." He went inside. Łotek. Victoria was in the sitting room with Eleanor, who was in the chair she'd claimed as definitively hers 6 years ago and had never relinquished. Eleanor had a blanket over her lap that she would have rejected indignantly 3 weeks ago as an implication about her health, and was apparently now accepting as a practical measure, which meant she was either feeling better or worse, and he couldn't immediately tell which. Victoria was on the couch with her own book, actually reading this time. He could tell because she didn't look up when he came in, which was different from the past month of not looking up. She was turned inward toward the page. Eleanor looked up. She said, "You look like you got dragged behind something." He said, "Long day." "Sit down. Victoria, get him something." Victoria looked up then. She read his face with the quick assessment of someone who had spent 8 years reading it, and then caught herself doing it, which he could see, that slight hesitation as she recalibrated, because she was still deciding how much of her instinctive care to act on. She said, "There's food in the kitchen. Ilaria left a plate." He said, "Thank you." He sat down across from his mother. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. She said, "Well?" He said, "It held for now." She nodded once. She picked up her book. That was the entire debrief. She knew better than to ask for detail, had always known better. That sharp woman who had spent 40 years in a life adjacent to this one and understood its language. He sat in the room with them for a while without going to get the food. Just sat. The lamp made its small, warm circle. Eleanor's page turned. Victoria returned to her book, and he watched the way her thumb moved slightly on the edge of the page, the habit she'd always had. And he thought, I know that about her. I know exactly what it looks like when she's absorbed in something versus pretending to be. He thought, I know her. He thought, I just stopped paying attention to what I knew. He ate the plate. Ilaria had left at 9:30, standing at the kitchen counter because he was too tired for the formality of a table. And when Victoria came in to get water, she found him like that, and didn't say anything about it. She got her glass of water. She was halfway to the door when he said, "Dr. Mehta, how did Eleanor do?" Victoria stopped, turned around. She said, "Better than expected. The numbers are good. She has restrictions she'll fight, but she'll follow." A pause. She told Dr. Mehta she planned to outlive the restrictions. Dr. Mehta said she hoped that was true. Did Eleanor like her? Something crossed Victoria's face. She told me in the car that the doctor was not entirely useless, which from Eleanor is essentially a standing ovation. He almost smiled. It almost reached his eyes. Victoria watched it happen and looked away. She said, "It was a good day with her. I want you to know that, despite everything." She moved her glass between her hands. "She talked about your father, in the car, on the way back. She doesn't talk about him much." He went still. "She said he used to stand at the library window at night, the same one you stand at." She didn't look at him. She said it used to worry her. She said men who needed to stand at windows at night were men who were working something out that they couldn't say out loud yet. He said nothing. "I thought you should know," Victoria said. He said, "Did she say what he was working out?" She said it changed over the years. When you were young, it was the business. When you were older, it was his health, which he also didn't tell her about directly. A pause. She said toward the end, the last few years, she thought he was standing there working out how to have asked for things he needed from people he loved, without it having taken him so long. The kitchen was very quiet. Victoria looked at him then, full on. The way she hadn't for weeks, the way she'd been carefully maintaining an angle that let her observe without being fully present, and now she was present, looking at him without the angle. She said, "Damien." He said, "I know. I need to say something. Not tonight. Tonight you're exhausted, and I'm not going to say important things to an exhausted person because it's not fair to either of us." She set the water glass down on the counter. "But I need you to know it's coming, that there are things I've been carrying for longer than 3 weeks. For longer than 8 years, if I'm honest. Things about myself that I let this life bury." She held his gaze. "I need to say them, and I need you to hear them, not process them, not respond to them strategically. Just hear them." He said, "I'll hear them." "You say that easily." "I know. I'm aware of how I say things easily." His voice was careful and entirely honest. "I can't prove the difference between what I say and what I'll actually do except by doing it. I know that." She looked at him for another long moment. She said, "Saturday. When things are settled and Eleanor is stable and you've had 2 days to actually sleep." She picked up the water glass. "Saturday we sit down." He said, "Saturday." She walked out. He stood at the counter and pressed his hand flat on the cold marble and breathed. Saturday arrived with a stillness that felt almost staged, one of those late autumn mornings where the air had gone crystalline and every sound carried further than it should, and the light, when it came hard and bright, and made everything look like it was being seen for the first time. Lorenzo Castellano had, as anticipated, repositioned. He'd sent word through a secondary channel that the meeting he'd proposed was being indefinitely deferred, which was the language men in this world used when they'd miscalculated and needed to save face while retreating. Damien had received this information Thursday morning and acknowledged it with a response so brief it was almost dismissive, which was itself a message, and the message was received. That part was over, not gone. Lorenzo was an ambitious man with a long memory, and there would be something else, another angle, another test. There was always another test. But the specific crisis that had put Victoria's name in rooms where it didn't belong, that had given Tavio's betrayal a shape and a consequence, that had closed. The window had closed. The story those men had been trying to tell about Damien Blackwood being compromised and distracted and undone by his own household had run out of its momentum. He'd sorted his house, in the way Fontaine meant and in the way that mattered more than what Fontaine meant. Now it was Saturday. He found her in the garden. He hadn't expected that. It was cold, the kind of cold that made breath visible. And the garden in November was not the garden in August, was bare and architectural and stripped of almost everything that made it soft. But Victoria was there, in a coat he recognized from years ago, one she'd had before she came to live in this house, standing near the far wall where the roses had been cut back to their thorny winter shapes. He walked out to her. She heard him coming and didn't turn, which meant she'd known he was coming, which meant she'd been waiting, which meant she was as aware of what today was as he was. He stopped a few feet from her. She was looking at the cut-back roses. He stood beside her and looked at them too. He said, "I always forget they look like that in winter." She said, "Most people do. They see them in summer when they're doing what roses are supposed to do." She touched one of the bare stems, lightly, just the tip of one finger. "But this is what they actually are, under everything." He said, "Is that a metaphor?" She almost laughed. Not quite. "I don't know, maybe." They stood there for a moment. The cold moved through both of them. He could see her breath. She said, "I want to start with something I haven't said out loud. Not to you, not to anyone." She kept her eyes on the roses. "When I heard you say that in the hallway, those words, my first feeling wasn't hurt." He waited. "My first feeling was recognition." Her voice was even, but it cost her. He could hear the cost in the particular steadiness of it, the kind of steadiness that is not natural, but assembled. Like something I'd suspected for a long time had finally been confirmed, and there was a part of me that felt almost relieved, like I could stop waiting to be wrong about it. He said nothing. "I'd been wrong about a lot of things," she said. "I told myself the coffee mattered, the dinners, the way I managed this house, the people in it, the way I made sure Eleanor wasn't alone in February, and Marcus knew someone cared whether he passed his exam." She paused. "I told myself I did those things because I loved you. And I did. Partly." She turned to look at him now.
But partly I did them because they were the only way I could feel like I was earning my place here, like I was valuable enough to stay. The words hit him somewhere below the sternum. He didn't let it show on his face, not because he was performing control, but because he needed to actually hear this, and his own reactions could wait. She said, "That's not your fault. Entirely. I walked into this life and I decided, somewhere early on, that the way to hold the attention of a man like you was to be indispensable. And I built that. I built it so well, I lost track of which parts were me and which parts were the structure I'd constructed." Her eyes were very steady. "When you said I was replaceable, you were partly wrong, but you were also partly describing something I'd done to myself. Made myself into a function, and then resented being seen as one," he said carefully. "Victoria." She said, "Let me finish." He closed his mouth. She looked back at the roses. "The month after that night, watching you learn the staff's names, sit at my mother-in-law's breakfast table, show up in a room full of children." She stopped. "I kept waiting for it to be strategic. I know how you think. I know you approach problems by identifying the correct lever. I thought, he's found the lever. He's applying it. In 6 weeks he'll stop, and this will be confirmed as exactly what I thought it was." She paused. "It didn't stop." He said, "No." "I know." She turned back to him fully. "And I don't know what to do with that. That's what I've been sitting with. Not anger. I moved through the anger faster than I expected. Not grief exactly, though there's grief." She looked at his face with the particular directness of someone who has prepared for this conversation and is not going to soften it unnecessarily. "There's 8 years of a marriage I built around the idea of you, the man I thought you were, the man I believed you could be if you ever stopped moving fast enough to look around." She paused. "And I don't know how to map that onto whoever you are right now, because you're different. I can see that you're different, but 8 years of a person's history doesn't just step aside because the person changes." He said, "No, it doesn't." "So what do I do with it?" He held her gaze. He said, "I don't know. I don't have an answer to that." He let that sit between them without trying to fill it. "I know what I can tell you. I can tell you that the man who said those words in the office that night, who sat in that room and said those 4 words and moved on to the next agenda item without even hesitating, I have looked at him very clearly. These past weeks, I have looked at him the way you look at something you don't want to see." His voice was low and undefended. "And I don't want to be him anymore. Not for you specifically, not as a strategy, because he was wrong about almost everything that mattered. And I lived inside that wrongness for years without examining it, because I was moving too fast, and the empire was running, and everything looked operational from the outside." She said, "It looked operational from the inside, too." "I know." He exhaled slowly. The breath was visible in the cold air. "That's the part that should have told me something. When everything looks fine and you stop checking underneath, that's not stability, that's avoidance." She was quiet. He said, "I can't take back 8 years. I know that. I can't take back February when you were in the hospital alone. I can't take back every time I looked at what you were doing here and filed it under maintenance instead of love." He paused. "I can't take back Tuesday night." She said, "No. But I'm here. I'm asking to be here. Not because it's efficient, not because it keeps the empire intact, or because Fontaine thinks it's a good idea, or because—" He stopped, found the actual bottom of it. "Because I have spent the past 6 weeks slowly understanding what this house felt like before you made it real. And what it felt like is exactly what I deserve if I don't do the work of becoming someone different." His voice was steady and a little raw, the way voices get when the performance has been stripped out of them. "I don't want to go back to that. I want to know what you were reading. I want to know what Theo wrote in his story about the dragon detective. I want to know what Eleanor said in the car." He stopped. "I want to know you the way you deserve to be known 8 years ago." Something moved in her face. He watched it happen. Not a breaking down. She wasn't that kind of woman. She didn't break down in gardens. But something behind her eyes shifted. Some load-bearing thing that had been holding a particular shape for a very long time, changing shape under the weight of what had just been said. She said, "That's the most words I've ever heard you say in a row that weren't about the business." He said, "I know. I'm aware that's also a problem." She said, "It's a little funny, actually." He said, "A little." She looked at him. The cold moved around them both. The bare roses stood in their winter shapes behind her. She said, "I don't know if I love you the way I used to."
I want you to know that. Not as a cruelty, just as the truth. She held his gaze. I replaced something. That night in the bedroom, sitting in the dark, I felt it go. It was like a specific light going out. The love that was desperate, urgent. The love that was always trying to earn something. She paused. I don't have that anymore. He said, I know. But there's something else. She looked down for a moment, then back up. Something that has been very annoying to discover, because it would be cleaner if there wasn't. She took a breath. There's something else still here. It doesn't look like what it looked like. It's smaller and more honest and a lot less comfortable. She let out a slow breath. I don't know what to do with it yet. He said, we don't have to know today. She said, no. We could just... He stopped, found the right words, which were simpler than he'd expected. We could just be here, in this, and see what it is. She studied him. She said, that sounds almost dangerously like patience. He said, I'm working on it. And something in her face did what it hadn't done in a very long time in his direction. It went warm. Not all the way. Not without reservations. But genuinely, specifically warm, like a door opening a few inches to check the weather before deciding whether to open further. She said, Ilaria's going to have breakfast ready soon. He said, I know. She said, Eleanor will be insufferable if we're late. He said, also true. Neither of them moved toward the house yet. He said, the coffee, what you said about the proportion, pulling too much from the grind. She said, yes. Show me. She looked at him. He said, show me how to do it right. When we go in. She held his gaze for a long moment. He watched her weigh it, the smallness of it, the simplicity, and also what the simplicity meant, and whether she was ready to be the person who taught him, and whether that was something she wanted, and whether wanting it was something she trusted yet. She said, it's not complicated. He said, no, but I've been doing it wrong for a month and you've been watching me do it wrong and you didn't say anything until I asked. She said, no, I didn't. I'm asking. Something settled in her expression. She nodded once and turned toward the house. He walked beside her. Inside, the kitchen was warm. Ilaria had been in and left again, that particular efficiency of someone who understood when a room needed to be available without being occupied. The light over the counter was on. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. Victoria went to the machine. He stood beside her, close enough to see what she was doing, far enough that she had space. She took the portafilter out. She showed him where he pulled too hard on the grind, the angle he used that distributed it unevenly. She showed him what even distribution looked like. She tamped it correctly and slid it in and hit the button, and they both waited in silence while the machine made its sound. It came out darker, richer. The smell was different. She poured 2 cups. She handed him one. He drank it. He said, that's it. She said, yes. He said, 8 years. She said, you never asked. He said, I know. He looked at the cup. I'm asking now. She drank her coffee. She didn't say anything, but she stayed in the kitchen beside him while she drank it, and that was its own answer, small and incomplete and entirely real. Eleanor came down at 8:40, which was late for her, and she looked at them both standing at the kitchen counter with their coffee, and she said nothing for 3 full seconds, which was unusual for a woman who had opinions ready for most situations. Then she said, the coffee smells right this morning. Victoria said, Damien made it. Eleanor looked at her son. He said, Victoria showed me. Eleanor said, took you long enough. She moved to the table and sat down. Now do the same with everything else. Victoria hid something behind her cup. He suspected it was the expression that had just been in her eyes, that small, warm thing still there. Ilaria appeared with Eleanor's appropriate and resented breakfast. Eleanor looked at it with the expression of a woman filing a complaint with management. Damien sat down across from his mother and picked up his coffee and said, Eleanor, tell me more about that book. She looked at him. He said, the one you were reading 2 weeks ago, the one you were telling me about. She studied him for a moment with the complete, unsentimental appraisal of a woman who had watched her son for 42 years and knew the difference between when he was performing interest and when he was actually present. She said, you were listening. He said, I was. She picked up her fork. She said, the protagonist is a complete fool for most of the middle section. He knows exactly what he's doing wrong, and he does it anyway. She pointed the fork briefly. It's realistic. Most people do that. He said, yes. She said, he comes around eventually, but it costs him. He said, it usually does. The author doesn't let him off easy. She took a bite of the food she'd decided to accept this morning without complaint, which was itself something. The price is real. The ending isn't tidy. He said, but it's honest. She looked at him across the breakfast table with the eyes of a woman who had lost a husband and raised a difficult son and sat in a hospital bed at midnight and said the things she should have said years earlier and had been watching these past weeks to see whether any of it had landed. She said, yes, it's honest. She went back to her breakfast. Victoria set a plate down in front of him that he hadn't asked for, Ilaria's food, the right things. She'd told the kitchen his preferences the same way she knew everyone's preferences. That specific attention she carried like a second kind of memory. She sat down beside Eleanor. The three of them were at the breakfast table on a Saturday morning in November, in a house that had been quiet and cold and full of controlled silences a month ago and was now something else. Not fixed, not resolved into the neat ending of a thing that had been settled, but occupied differently, by people who were being more honest with each other than they had been, by a man learning the correct coffee proportion, by a woman teaching it, by an old woman eating her restricted breakfast without complaint for the first time in 2 weeks, which meant she'd decided, in her private and absolute way, that things here were worth being present for. After breakfast, Damien called Caruso and handled 3 operational items that had been waiting. He handled them at his desk, door open, which was new. The door had always been closed. It was open now not as a statement, but because he'd noticed that a closed door in this house had come to mean something, and what it meant wasn't something he wanted to keep meaning. At noon, he went to find Marcus and confirm the week's schedule, and while they were talking, he asked about the final class, and Marcus told him the date, and Damien put it in his phone, which Marcus noticed and didn't comment on. At 2 o'clock, he walked past the east sitting room and heard Victoria on the phone, something about the children's hospital program, a scheduling issue with one of the other volunteers. He kept walking. He did not stop to listen, but he registered the specific way her voice changed when she was talking about it, the quality of engagement, the way it carried, and he thought, that's hers. That's the part of her that was always hers and that I spent years not asking about. At 4, he was back at his desk when he heard Eleanor's voice from down the hall, laughing, a real laugh, the full one she had when something actually struck her, not the polite version she used for public situations. He didn't know what had made her laugh. He heard Victoria's voice respond, lower, and then Eleanor laughed again. He sat at his desk and listened to that sound move through the house. He thought, this is what I almost lost. Not the empire, not the standing with the families, not the operational superiority that had kept this organization functional for 2 decades. This, 2 women laughing down the hall on a Saturday afternoon in November. He thought, I have to keep earning this. He thought, not as a strategy, not as a lever, as the actual work of being a person in relation to other people. The grinding, daily, unspectacular work of noticing and asking and remembering and showing up and doing it again tomorrow. He thought, I don't know if I'm capable of it. He thought, I'm going to find out. That evening, the 3 of them ate dinner at the table together, which had not happened without a formal occasion or an external reason in longer than he could remember. Ilaria had made something appropriate for Eleanor and generous for the others, and there was wine that Damien poured and then left on the table without pushing at anyone to drink it. Eleanor told them about a neighbor she'd had 40 years ago, a story he'd never heard, about a woman who had grown tomatoes on a fire escape in a Manhattan apartment with such single-minded determination that the other tenants had eventually started leaving notes requesting specific varieties. She told it well. Eleanor told all her stories well, and Victoria asked questions that opened it up further, the way she always did, the way that made people feel their own stories were worth the space they took. He sat at the head of his table and listened and ate Ilaria's food and thought, I know how to control a room. I have always known how to control a room. He was only just learning how to be in one. Later, when Eleanor had gone upstairs and the table had been cleared, they sat on the terrace for a while because Victoria had said she wanted air and he had said he'd come with her. The cold was real now, November doing what November did, and they both had coats, and the garden was dark except for the path lights making their orange circles. He said, Can I ask you something? She said, Yes. He said, The hospital, February, 2 years ago. He looked out at the garden. I wasn't there. She said, No. I should have been. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you didn't know. I should have known. You should have been able to reach me. He turned to look at her. I've thought about that more than almost anything else in the past month. That you went through that alone because the channel between us was... He stopped. Found the right word. Blocked. By my own design. I kept work separate from home and home separate from everything real. And what that meant in practice was that when you needed me, you couldn't get to me. She held his gaze. He said, I'm sorry for that. Specifically. Not as a category of sorry for all of it. That one, specifically. She said, Damien. He waited. She said, I was angry about that for a long time. After. I told myself I wasn't, that I understood the life, that you couldn't be reached, that it wasn't personal. She looked at the garden. It was personal. It was the most personal thing that's ever happened to me, and you weren't there, and I have carried that by myself for 2 years. He said, I know. Do you? I know I can't unknow it now. I know it happened and it cost you, and the cost was real, and it happened anyway. His voice was low. And I know that you covered for me, with yourself, in your head, the way you covered for a lot of things. Told yourself a version of the story where it made sense that you were alone. He paused. I don't want you to cover for me anymore. Not for anything. She looked at him. He said, if something happens to you, I want to be reachable. That's a structural change, not a feeling. It's something I can actually do, and I'm going to do it. He held her eyes. And if you're angry about something, I want you to say it. Not the managed version. Not the version you've processed into a shape that's easier for me to hear. The actual version. She said, that might be uncomfortable. He said, I know. She said, I can be unkind when I'm actually angry. Not often, but I can be. He said, so can I. We're probably even. Something crossed her face. That warmth again, a little wider this time, the door opening a few more inches. She said, that's also a little funny. He said, a little. The cold sat around them. Above the garden, the sky was fully dark now, and the city's light pollution made a low orange haze on the horizon, the way it always did, the eternal ambient light of a city that never fully went dark. She said, Damien, can I ask you something now? He said, yes. She said, that night, in the office, when you said what you said. She turned to look at him directly. Did you believe it? That I could be replaced? He sat with that. He said, I think I believed the version of it that my mind had been running for years without examining, that people in functions could be replaced by better functions, that what you did for this house was a role rather than... He stopped. I didn't think about what was underneath it. The specific person underneath it? No. He paused. I didn't believe it the way you mean. I believed something worse. I believed it without thinking about it at all. She said, that's honest. He said, I know it's not better. She said, no, but it's accurate. She looked back at the garden. I think that's what hurt most. That it wasn't malice. It was absence. You just weren't thinking about me. He said, no, I wasn't. She said, I need to not be someone you forget to think about. He said, I know. She said, that has to be different. Not an effort you make in crisis and then let lapse. Actually different. He said, I know. I'm trying to build it differently, slowly. I know slow isn't satisfying. She said, slow is the only version I trust. He said, then slow. She said, then slow. The wind came up off the garden, and they both felt it at the same moment, and she pulled her coat closer and he watched her do it. He reached over, and this time it was not a hospital car in the middle of the night. This time it was a terrace at his own house at 9 p.m, and his hand found the space between them and waited there. Open. Not asking. Just present. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She looked at the garden for a long moment, at the bare roses in the dark and the orange circles of the path lights and the haze of the city above the wall, and she breathed, slowly, in and out, a breath that had something of the quality of a decision in it. And she took his hand. Not the way she used to, not the urgent holding on way, not the proving something way. Something quieter. Her fingers settled into the space between his and held there without grip, just presence. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He sat with her in the cold on the terrace of a house that had been, for 1 month, a place where two people were learning what they'd cost each other. And he held her hand, and she held his, and the garden was dark, and the city went on making its light,
And Eleanor was upstairs in her room with her restricted dinner and her book and her opinions, alive and sharp and entirely herself. He thought, this is not a resolution. He thought, this is a beginning, a real one, with actual ground under it, not the ground they'd been standing on before, which had looked solid from a distance and turned out, on examination, to have been mostly held up by her determination and his inattention. He thought, it will be hard. It will require the kind of sustained effort that his entire life had trained him to apply to everything except this. He thought, do it anyway. He thought, she's worth it, and you know she's worth it. And now finally, 8 years late, and at significant cost to both of you, you are done pretending you don't know. The terrace was cold and quiet. Her thumb moved slightly against the back of his hand. He thought, that. He thought, that is what you almost threw away. He closed his hand gently around hers, and the night settled over the Blackwood estate the way nights settle when the worst of something is behind you, and the rest is the long, ordinary, necessary work of becoming. Not the people you were, not the people you pretended to be, but the people who stayed in the cold on a November terrace and held on and chose, quietly,